Good evening. I'm Michael Smerconish in for Chris Matthews. Let me start tonight with Benghazi. Do Republicans have a smoking gun? No. Do they have enough to keep the story alive? Yes. And today we learned that the State Department asked for and received changes made to the administration's talking points after the attack. That doesn't mean that Hillary Clinton or President Obama orchestrated a conspiracy to cover up some sort of malfeasance, but it does give Republicans fuel to keep this story alive, and they are. Throw in Lindsey Graham's call for Mrs. Clinton to testify before Congress and a new anti-Hillary ad by Karl Rove, and you've got a growing political story. David Korn is Washington bureau chief for Mother Jones Magazine and an MSNBC political analyst. Danielle Pletka is vice president of the American Enterprise Institute. We now know that the talking points used by Susan Rice were changed 12 times in a 24-hour period, and the White House and State Department were more involved in that process than was previously revealed. The first draft of the talking points included a specific reference to, quote, Islamic extremists with ties to al-Qaeda participating in the attack. That was eventually scrubbed. Also, there was this paragraph, as ABC reported today, quote, the agency has produced numerous pieces on the threat of extremists linked to al-Qaeda in Benghazi and eastern Libya. These noted that since April, there have been at least 5 other attacks against foreign interests in Benghazi by unidentified assailants, including the June attack against the British ambassador's convoy. We cannot rule out the individuals has previously surveilled the U.S. facilities, also contributing to the efficacy of the attacks. In an email, according to ABC, State Department spokesperson Victoria Nuland took issue with that information because it could, quote, be abused by members of Congress to beat up the State Department for not paying attention to warnings, so why would we want to feed that either? Concerned, unquote. The entire paragraph was eventually scrubbed. All the news today made for a testy White House press briefing with Press Secretary Jay Carney clearly playing defense on the talking points.
Jay, you told us that the only changes that were made were stylistic. Is it a stylistic change to take out all references to previous terror threats in Benghazi?
Well, I appreciate the question again, and I think that what I was referring to was the talking points that the CIA drafted and sent around, to which one change was made. And I accept that stylistic may not precisely describe a change of one word to another.
Jay, this was not a change of one word to another.
No, I'm just...
Jay, these underwent extensive changes after they were written by the CIA.
Sure. There was an interagency process, which is always the case, because a lot of agencies have a stake in a matter like this.
That was Jonathan Karl asking that question. He's the one who broke these stories, this story for ABC. Danielle, let me begin with you. When you look at the editing of the talking points, is this the way it looks when you're watching sausage being made, or is this evidence of some form of cover-up?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both, honestly. Clearly, in any executive branch discussion, you're going to have different agencies fighting with each other. You're going to have them trying to protect their interests and their turf. That's the sausage-making part. The issue here is, what was the White House looking for in taking out all references to terrorism? That's the part that really concerns me, because it goes along with what was later said about this not being terrorism, suggesting that, in fact, it was all about a YouTube video.
But what would be the upside? What would be the upside for the White House in trying to keep a limitation on terrorism? In other words, I'm of a mindset that says 8 weeks out from an election, it might not, politically speaking, it might not be a bad thing if it is a case of terror, because we have a tendency to rally around the chief executive.
That's a little bit Machiavellian even for me, but I think you've asked exactly the right question. Now think about this from the Republicans' perspective. We get why the president didn't want to admit that this was a case of terrorism, because in fact the entire meme of his re-election on national security was, I killed Osama bin Laden, al-Qaeda is on its heels. So they didn't want to admit it was an act of terrorism. But there's a bigger problem here, and that is that despite the fact that they knew that it was an act of terrorism, they kept pressing back. They kept trying to go back to this other story. I think, honestly speaking, that's one of the reasons why people are so perplexed. They keep trying to cover up what actually happened. It makes people think something worse happened.
David, I want to ask you about David. Let me ask you about Victoria Nuland. She took further issue with the talking points several hours later, and she wrote, quote, "These don't resolve all my issues or those of my building leadership." Obviously, well, we think a reference to Secretary Clinton.
Well, she meant, the leadership of the State Department. A couple of points here. You said earlier, was this politics? Was it a scandal? It's kind of in between. Jay Carney did get caught not giving the full story about the process that led of these revisions when he spoke about this a couple of months ago. David Petraeus, the former CIA director, has told why the CIA took out the references to the al-Qaeda linked group that were in the early versions of the talking points. So that's been explained, Danielle. You may not agree or accept, but that wasn't a White House revision. The major revision came from the State Department, not from the White House. And it had to do with what happened before the attack, not whether you call this terrorism or not. So I think in a lot of ways the conservative theory of the case here has been almost disproven by these revisions.
David, let me ask you this question, because you would know these, David, you would know these facts better than I, perhaps. To an outsider, to a layperson, to hear that there were 12 revisions to the talking points, that sounds ominous in the in the normal course of events. How often is something like this edited, revised?
Oh, I mean, if you look at some of the revisions, if you go through them, and I salute Jonathan Call for putting this online, you can see that in some of these revisions, some forms, 1 or 2 words were taken out that had no real substantive meaning. But it's not unusual for an interagency thing that involves multiple agencies to bounce around again and again and again and again, and before it's all resolved. So that's not unusual at all.
Hang on a second, David. Hang on, just 1 second. First
of all, the process here?
The emails that were released by the Weekly Standard of Dave Petraeus's reaction to this were not, oh, this was all fine with me, I wanted it to be taken out. He was very surprised that these were taken out. So that's number one. Number two, you're totally right. Lots of revisions happen. That's very normal. The issue is, what was the intent here with the revisions, and why did the White House feel the need to lie about it? Why did they feel the need to keep lying about it? Why did they feel the need to keep saying that this was about something that it wasn't about? I think that everybody who looks at this objectively can understand that the White House gave every appearance of having something to hide, and that's a big part of the problem here.
Danielle,
in addition,
allow me to respond to that, if I might.
Yeah.
I want to show everybody something. The idea that there was a vast cover-up involved was shot down by Ambassador Thomas Pickering. He co-authored the most extensive independent investigation of the Benghazi attacks, and here's what he told Andrea Mitchell this week.
I believe, in fact, the Accountability Review Board did its work well. I think that the notion of, quote, a cover-up has all the elements of Pulitzer Prize fiction attached to it.
I play this because, Danielle, that's an individual who looked at the facts and has come to the conclusion that there was not a lie nor a cover-up in this case.
What's the cover-up? And Watergate.
Let Danielle respond to that, and then you, David.
Question. Thanks. Okay, I've known Tom Pickering for almost 20 years. Tom was the author of that. He is an esteemed diplomat and a former Foreign Service officer. The bottom line is, they did not talk to Gregory Hicks, the deputy chief of mission in Baghdad. They didn't talk to the chief security officer. They were doing a job for the State Department. He's very loyal to them. I appreciate that. But I would also add that Tom Pickering turned down an invitation from the House of Representatives to defend the Administrative Review Board. Instead, he went on and talked to a much more sympathetic interlocutor, Andrea Mitchell.
David Corn, respond to that, please.
But not good for the country.
Listen, not appearing before Dara Ice's committee when he's made all sorts of outlandish charges about this, I don't think is, it gets to the credibility of Tom Pickering. But the big issue here is, what is the cover-up? What do if you look, the review board, found wrongdoing on the part of the State Department, and some of those people have been punished, some people have been resigned, and that's been resolved. If you make the conservative charge is that the president is covering up some malfeasance or something, but if you look at the revisions, you don't see the White House being involved in covering these things up. It's Victoria Nuland, who actually is not a political appointee, but a career Foreign Service person who worked for the National Security Council during the Bush years.
Hey, David, when you see Jay Carney at 4 p.m. on a Friday holding a briefing, having already had a background briefing, that tells you this thing is very high on the attention scale of the White House. I think, unlike any time in the whole era post-September 11, meaning this September 11 that we're talking about.
Jay Carney got caught saying something that wasn't completely true. Now,
That's called a lie, David.
No. We in Washington, well, everything you say that's not true may not be a lie, but if you want to accept that premise, I'll happily accuse you of lying when you get things wrong.
I'll let you try that out on your kids.
But nevertheless, you know, in this city, if something is wrong, we have a scale of 0 to 10. And so you have Lindsey Graham out there saying this is Watergate. You have Darrell Issa making all sorts of ludicrous charges. If Jay Carney and the White House didn't tell the complete truth, that is something that deserves reporting and conversation, but it doesn't make it a major league scandal yet.
And I watched Jay Carney handle this afternoon, and frankly, he didn't back off from his prior assertion on the issue of how far this might lead, according to critics of the White House. As you were just referencing earlier this week, Mike Huckabee predicted the president would not fill out his term due to Benghazi. And today on a radio program, Senator James Inhofe predicted that people would soon, start discussing the I word, impeachment. Listen to this.
Of all of the great cover-ups in history, we're talking about the Pentagon Papers, the Iran-Contra, Watergate, and all the rest of them. This, I said back in November 28th on Fox, is going to go down as the most serious, most egregious cover-up in American history. People may be starting to use the I word before too long.
Okay, the I word meaning impeachment.
Yeah.
Danielle, is that far-fetched to you?
Yes, I think that what he said was silly, but I also think that by trotting out all of these straw men, you're failing to address the central problem here, which is, A, the President of the United States went out when he knew there was a terrorist attack, and he said that it was all about a demonstration and a YouTube video. The ambassador to the UN did the same thing, so did Hillary Clinton. I'm less excited about the talking points and much more excited about why they felt the need to lie for 5 days to the American people. If that doesn't merit an investigation, I don't know what does.
I can't let it pass that you use, wait a minute, David. I can't let it pass that you use the lie word. Lie assumes malice of forethought. Lie assumes someone knows what they're saying is deliberately untrue.
I think that we know that when they read the talking...
I listened to you. Just permit me a final word. I don't think the record speaks to that fact. It may never speak to that fact. Now we've both been heard, and I do thank you. Danielle Pletka and David Korn. Coming up, we know Republicans are eager to rough up Hillary, and some are happily discussing impeachment. We're going to look at whether there's any real political fallout here. Also,